Did you know that there is an intriguing theory that suggests that Moses, one of the greatest biblical leaders and author of the first 5 books of the Bible, could have stuttered? Moses is famous for having guided the Israelites out of Egypt and on the journey to the Promised Land, making his life and personal characteristics a subject of great curiosity. One of the most interesting questions about Moses is whether he really faced speech difficulties, such as stuttering. The hypothesis that Moses could have had problems with diction can help us better understand his figure, showing that even great leaders have their own limitations. But is there any basis for this theory? Was Moses really a stutterer, or is this idea just baseless speculation? In this video, we will investigate the origin of this theory. It is based on some excerpts from the book of Exodus, where Moses expresses concerns about his ability to speak. However, the Bible does not directly describe Moses as stuttering. Let's examine these verses and explore what the tradition and texts actually say about this possibility. The idea that Moses might have had a speech impediment such as stuttering comes from a more careful analysis of his self-description. In the book of Exodus, chapter 4, verse 10, Moses expresses his doubts about his ability to speak when called by God to lead the liberation of Israel. "Our Lord, I have never been eloquent, not in the past, not even now that you have spoken to your servant, for I am heavy of mouth and heavy of tongue." This verse raises questions about the kind of difficulties Moses faced. Many scholars believe that he saw himself as incapable of expressing himself clearly or persuasively. The expression heavy of mouth and heavy of tongue may suggest that he had trouble communicating effectively. Some interpret the expression, "I have a heavy tongue," as indicating a physical difficulty in speaking, leading to the hypothesis that Moses may have stuttered. However, to understand what Moses really meant, it is important to consider the broader context of Scripture. At that moment, Moses was receiving a monumental mission from God. Their objections included not only difficulty speaking, but also other concerns. Interestingly, in the New Testament, Deacon Stephen describes Moses as mighty in word and deed during his time in Egypt, which seems to contrast with Moses' view of his own speaking abilities. Let's explore these interpretations and what they really mean to better understand the true nature of Moses' difficulties. In the book of Acts of the Apostles, chapter 7, Stephen portrays Moses in a very positive light. At that time, Moses was born, who was an extraordinary boy. For 3 months he was raised in his father's house. When he was abandoned, Pharaoh's daughter took him in and raised him as her own son. Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and became mighty in word and deed. Stephen describes Moses as someone mighty in word and deed, suggesting that he spoke and acted with great authority. This portrayal contrasts with Moses' self-description in the book of Exodus, where he sees himself as heavy of mouth and heavy of tongue. Before his escape to Midian, Moses lived in Pharaoh's court and received a sophisticated education that included advanced communication skills. Therefore, many scholars believe that the expression, "I have a heavy tongue," used by Moses may not refer to a physical speech problem such as stuttering, but rather to a sense of personal inadequacy. It is possible that after years of living in the desert, Moses felt that his ability to express himself had diminished, or that he was not up to the task God entrusted to him. Your objection may have been more a matter of self-evaluation and perception of your own abilities than an actual physical problem. Later, in Exodus 6:12, Moses again expresses his concerns, describing himself as someone with uncircumcised lips, an expression that could be understood as lips that speak with difficulty, or even impure lips. This term is similar to what the prophet Isaiah uses in Isaiah 6:5 when he speaks of his own impurity. The exact interpretation of what Moses meant by this expression is unclear, but many scholars believe that he was not referring to a physical speech impediment, such as stuttering, but rather to a lack of confidence in his communication skills. Despite having received a thorough education in Egypt, Moses spent decades as a shepherd in the desert before being called by God to his great mission. This long absence from public life and formal training may have contributed to his feeling of inadequacy. Moses' frustration in Exodus 4:10 can be compared to how the Apostle Paul describes himself in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, where he admits that some considered him a weak speaker. In both cases, both Moses and Paul express a personal perception of inadequacy that does not necessarily reflect their true abilities. The central point here is that Moses' hesitation to accept the divine call reveals a deeper issue, a lack of faith. Moses' real difficulty was not his ability to speak, but his inability to fully trust in the power of God, who was calling him to fulfill a great mission. By focusing on his own limitations, Moses was ignoring the divine strength and purpose that sustained him. Moses' excessive concern for his own abilities was a mistake that manifested itself in several objections to his divine calling. Instead of focusing on the mission, Moses questioned his leadership ability and the Israelites' acceptance. However, God did not correct Moses for his self-evaluation, but for his lack of trust in the divine plan. God's response to Moses' concerns about his eloquence and speech difficulties was direct. Who made man's mouth? Who makes the mute, the deaf, the seeing, or the blind? Am I not the Lord? Go now, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you should speak. Exodus 4:11-20. It is notable that Moses tried to justify his refusal with a limitation in his speech before the one who created the very mouth of man. Despite this divine response, Moses insisted that God send someone else. Moses' persistence in rejecting the divine call angered the Lord, as recorded in the Bible. However, these excuses did not impede God's purpose. God had already prepared Aaron, the eloquent brother of Moses, to serve as his spokesman. The relationship between Moses and Aaron is similar to that of a prophet with God. Although Moses may have felt inadequate, God provided the resources necessary to fulfill his will. This dynamic ensured that the divine plan was carried out, demonstrating that even when we feel insufficient, God can make up for our deficiencies and accomplish his purposes through us. While it is possible that Moses had speech difficulties such as stuttering, these issues were not insurmountable barriers to his mission. It is important to note that the Bible does not categorically confirm that Moses stuttered, and the term used in Exodus 4:10 is ambiguous and can be interpreted in several ways. The text may simply reflect Moses' lack of confidence in his public speaking abilities, something understandable given his long period in the desert tending flocks, without the practice of communicating in front of large audiences. The central point of this narrative is not the question of whether Moses stuttered or not, but the way in which God supplied and qualified Moses for his mission, despite his human limitations. The story of Moses is a powerful demonstration of how God can use our weaknesses to fulfill his purposes. Moses' effectiveness as a leader depended not on his natural abilities, but on the divine power that sustained him. God empowered Moses to perform one of the greatest works in biblical history, showing that obedience to the divine calling is more significant than our personal insecurities. I always emphasize here on the channel that God fulfills his purposes through us and despite us. Moses' life perfectly illustrates this truth, showing that when we trust in the Lord, he transforms our weaknesses into tools for his eternal purpose. God brought his plan to fruition through Moses, regardless of the weaknesses and insecurities that Moses demonstrated. Even though he could have stuttered or used this difficulty as an excuse to avoid the divine call, God's plan was effectively accomplished. We can extract 3 practical lessons from this story. Lesson 1. Trust in God, not just your abilities. Moses felt inadequate for the mission God entrusted to him, something many of us experience when we are called to serve. We often use our weaknesses as excuses for not responding to the divine call. However, just as God promised Moses that he would be with his mouth and teach him to speak, we must trust that God will also empower us to fulfill his purpose, even in the areas where we feel weakest. Our trust must be in God's power and provision, not just our personal abilities. Second lesson, respond with obedience to God's call. Moses' hesitation in accepting the divine mission reflected a lack of faith and trust in God. This example teaches us the importance of obeying promptly when God calls us. Focusing on our limitations can make us forget what God can accomplish through us. We must respond to God's call with faith and obedience, certain that he will be with us and enable us to carry out his plan. Third lesson, God turns our weaknesses into instruments for his glory. The story of Moses demonstrates that God can use even our weaknesses to accomplish his purposes. The Apostle Paul had a similar experience when he repeatedly asked God to remove a thorn in his flesh. God's response to Paul was a powerful revelation. "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." 2 Corinthians 12:9. God showed Paul that his grace is sufficient and that his strength is fully manifested through our weaknesses. These lessons remind us that by trusting God, obeying his callings, and recognizing that he can use our weaknesses, we become powerful instruments for his glory. Moses' life is a testimony that, even in our imperfections, God accomplishes his great purposes. "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." This response from God to the Apostle Paul reveals a profound truth. Our weaknesses are not impediments to God's work, but opportunities for his grace and power to manifest themselves with greater clarity. In the context of our human frailty, God's power becomes more evident. Our limitations should not be seen as insurmountable barriers, but as opportunities for God to display his greatness and fulfill his will. The success of the divine mission in our lives is not defined by our abilities or capabilities, but by the grace and power of the Lord acting through us. Instead of avoiding or lamenting our limitations, we should see them as part of the divine plan. Just as God used Moses and Paul to accomplish his purposes, he can also turn our weaknesses into tools to advance his kingdom and glorify his name. By trusting the Lord and accepting that he uses our limitations to demonstrate his glory, we allow his power to manifest in powerful, transformative ways. To conclude, the discussion about whether Moses stuttered or not teaches us a profound lesson about the sufficiency of God's grace. Our limitations do not define the success of our mission. It is God's powerful grace that empowers and strengthens us to fulfill his purpose. If you found this video interesting and enriching, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future content. Your participation is essential for us. We also want to know your opinion. Do you think Moses stuttered or not? Leave your comment below and share your perspective. Until the next video.